Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, first published in 1948. I have the paperback edition from '84. This was an important book when it came out. It did well. It was successful. Helped to reinvigorate some conservative ideas after World War II, and after so much of the conservative movement had gotten bound up with the America First movement, and then they needed to sort of figure out where they were going and what they were all about after World War II ended. And so 1948, this book came out to sort of state the conservative case. And so it was pretty successful. It's a fairly brief book, less than 200 pages. I'm going to read a couple sections like I always do, chapters 1 and chapter 2, a couple parts from each. The first chapter is called The Unsentimental Sentiment. And that sort of reminded me of early William James' sentiment of rationality, and Hume and Reid, and Hume particularly, and how they talk about the priority of the sentiments over the rational mind, how the rational mind is directed by the sentiments. This even comes back to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. That's what this reminded me of. And even the name of the book, Ideas Have Consequences, makes you think about this might be a book that has a sort of pragmatic twist to it. And in a way it does. The title is kind of self-explanatory. Like, we need to think about ideas because they have consequences. We can't just ignore the reigning philosophy. Different ideas about the nature of reality and how people should interact with one another these ideas always have consequences. And a lot of times the consequences are unintended, unforeseen. But to understand the world we live in now, we can sort of look to some of the ideas that underpin it and see if those ideas have caused the consequences that we see. And so it is kind of pragmatic in the sense that it's not just looking at the ideas as to whether or not, they make logical sense or they're coherent internally as ideas. It's not just looking at the ideas and analyzing them as ideas, but saying that the ideas have value or should be shunned or should be accepted or should be adopted or should be dealt with on an idea-by-idea basis based on what the consequences of those ideas are. And there's a sort of pragmatic concept in there baked into the idea because the consequences are what ultimately drive the evaluation of the idea. It has to prove itself. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. If the idea doesn't have the intended consequences, it's not gonna. The idea has to give way. The facts don't give way. So there's a bit of a pragmatic, but also parts of it, as you'll see as I read some of these sections, he really doesn't agree with the pragmatists on some core things. So starting here with chapter 1, he says, quote, "Every man participating in a culture has 3 levels of conscious reflection: his specific ideas about things, his general beliefs or convictions, and his metaphysical dream of the world. The first of these are the thoughts he employs in the activity of daily living. They direct his disposition of immediate matters, and so constitute his worldliness. One can exist on this level alone for limited periods, though pure worldliness must eventually bring disharmony and conflict. Above this lies his body of beliefs, some of which may be heritages simply, but others of which he will have acquired in the ordinary course of his reflection. Even the simplest souls define a few rudimentary conceptions about the world, which they repeatedly apply as choices present themselves. These, too, however, rest on something more general. Surmounting all is an intuitive feeling about the immanent nature of reality, and this is the sanction to which both ideas and beliefs are ultimately referred for verification. Without the metaphysical dream, it is impossible to think of men living together harmoniously over an extent of time. The dream carries with it an evaluation, which is the bond of spiritual community. When we affirm that philosophy begins with wonder, we are affirming in effect that sentiment is anterior to reason. We do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been drawn to it by an effective interest. In the cultural life of man, therefore, the fact of paramount importance about anyone is his attitude toward the world. How frequently it is brought to our attention that nothing good can be done if the will is wrong. Reason alone fails to justify itself. Not without cause has the devil been called the prince of lawyers, and not by accident are Shakespeare's villains good reasoners. If the disposition is wrong, reason increases maleficence. If it is right, reason orders and furthers the good. We have no authority to argue anything of a social or political nature unless we have shown by our primary volition that we approve some aspects of the existing world. The position is arbitrary in the sense that here is a proposition behind which there stands no prior. We begin our other affirmations after a categorical statement that life and the world are to be cherished. It appears, then, that culture is originally a matter of yea-saying, and thus we can understand why its most splendid flourishing stands often in proximity with the primitive phase of a people, in which there are powerful feelings of oughtness directed toward the world, and before the failure of nerve has begun. Simple approbation is the initial step only. A developed culture is a way of looking at the world through an aggregation of symbols, so that empirical facts take on significance, and man feels that he is acting in a drama, in which the cruxes of decision sustain interest and maintain the tone of his being. For this reason, a true culture cannot be content with a sentiment which is sentimental with regard to the world. There must be a source of clarification, of arrangement, and hierarchy, which will provide grounds for the employment of the rational faculty. Now man first begins this clarification when he becomes mythologist, and Aristotle has noted the close relationship between myth-making and philosophy. This poetry of representation, depicting an ideal world, is a great cohesive force, binding whole peoples to the acceptance of a design and fusing their imaginative life. Afterward comes the philosopher, who points out the necessary connection between phenomena, yet who may, at the other end, leave the pedestrian level to talk about final destination. Thus, in the reality of his existence, man is impelled from behind by the life-affirming sentiment and drawn forward by some conception of what he should be. The extent to which his life is shaped in between these by the conditions of the physical world is indeterminable, and so many supposed limitations have been transcended that we must at least allow the possibility that volition has some influence upon them. The most important goal for one to arrive at is this imaginative picture of what is otherwise a brute empirical fact, the donné of the world. His rational faculty will then be in the service of a vision which can preserve his sentiment from sentimentality. There is no significance to the sound and fury of his life, as of a stage tragedy, unless something is being affirmed by the complete action. And we can say of one as of the other that the action must be within the bounds of reason, if our feeling toward it is to be informed and proportioned, which is a way of saying if it is to be just. The philosophically ignorant vitiate their own actions by failing to observe measure. This explains why pre-cultural periods are characterized by formlessness and post-cultural by the clashing of forms. This explains why pre-cultural periods are characterized by formlessness and post-cultural by the clashing of forms. The darkling plain, swept by alarms, which threatens to be the world of our future, is an arena in which conflicting ideas, numerous after their accumulation of centuries, are freed from the discipline earlier imposed by ultimate conceptions. The decline is to confusion. We are agitated by sensation, and look with wonder upon the serene, somnambulistic creations of souls which had the metaphysical anchorage. Our ideas become convenient perceptions, and we accept contradiction because we no longer feel the necessity of relating thoughts to the metaphysical dream. It must be apparent that logic depends upon the dream, and not the dream upon it. We must admit this when we realize that logical processes rest ultimately on classification, that classification is by identification, and that identification is intuitive. It follows, then, that a waning of the dream results in a confusion of counsel, such as we behold on all sides in our time. Whether we describe this as a decay of religion or loss of interest in metaphysics, the result is the same, for both are centers with power to integrate, and if they give way, there begins a dispersion which never ends until the culture lies in fragments. End quote. So that's the very beginning of chapter 1, and it's pretty cool. He talks about he starts off talking about 3 levels of conscious reflection. People have three levels: his specific ideas about things, his general beliefs or convictions, and his metaphysical dream of the world. So the most fundamental and innermost concept is the metaphysical dream of the world. Describing that dream, he says, surmounting all is an intuitive feeling about the immanent nature of reality. And this is the sanction to which both ideas and beliefs are ultimately referred for verification. So it's the core truth that all the other truths are dependent upon, and it in and of itself is not dependent on any other truth. It's not justified by anything. It's an intuitive feeling about the nature of reality. And it's this sort of core sentiment that affirms your basic beliefs and your most basic concepts. And this sort of does relate back to common sense realism a little bit, in the sense that you have basic truths about the world that you just intuit, and it's not within the realm of reason and rationality to try to solve. It's a different faculty of your brain, such as your perceptions and things of that nature. It's these basic truths about reality sort of solidify a certain path for philosophy to take that prevents it from going off into irrelevant areas. And this basic path of philosophy, the basic path of human cognition, is pointed by these intuitive metaphysical dreams. The beliefs about things is dependent on that, and then our day-to-day ideas are dependent on those beliefs. And he basically says that this metaphysical dream guides all of our other actions and essentially creates a stock of symbols that all the other things take on a bit of the impressions of the metaphysical dream. And our understanding of reality, or the rules we live by, are guided by our vision of this metaphysical dream. And it's sort of Platonic forms that are created by it or are bound up with it. And when we give up the forms, we give up something important. Talking about sort of ideals that certain cultures aim at. He says, a developed culture is a way of looking at the world through an aggregation of symbols, so that empirical facts take on significance, and man feels that he is acting in a drama, in which the cruxes of decision sustain interest and maintain the tone of his being. So the things he does take on a symbolic importance above and beyond the empirical facts of man's existence. He says, for this reason, a true culture cannot be content with a sentiment which is sentimental with regard to the world. There must be a source of clarification. So in order for the drama to take place, in order for the set of symbols to work, they have to be defined. And a clarification and a categorization must occur to maintain the definition of symbols that provide coherence to a culture. He says there must be a source of clarification, of arrangement, and hierarchy, which will provide grounds for the employment of the rational faculty. Now you can begin to unleash your rational faculty once the symbols are set in stone and the culture adheres to them. Man first begins this clarification when he becomes mythologist. And Aristotle has noted the close relationship between myth-making and philosophy. So first comes the mythological underpinnings bound up in the metaphysical dream. The myths form the shape of culture, and those myths soon step back from the realm of religion and into the realm and begin or open up the realm of philosophy as it's going to exist in that particular culture. He says this poetry of representation depicting an ideal world is a great cohesive force, binding whole peoples to the acceptance of a design and fusing their imaginative life. This is the birth of culture. Afterward comes the philosopher, who points out the necessary connection between phenomena, yet who may, at the other end, leave the pedestrian level to talk about the final destination. So the philosopher is not necessarily completely unbound from myth. And why would we want our philosophers to unbind themselves from our cultural norms? We don't want philosophers to behave as termites, right? We want them bound up in the adherence to the cultural norms like everybody else. Philosophy is dangerous. I like the later portion of this section I read when he talks about, he says, the philosophically ignorant vitiate their own actions by failing to observe measure. This explains why pre-cultural periods are characterized by formlessness and post-cultural by the clashing of forms. The darkling plain, swept by alarms, which threatens to be the world of our future, is an arena in which conflicting ideas, numerous after the accumulation of centuries, are freed from the discipline earlier imposed by ultimate conceptions. So that's where he begins to talk about the collapse of the forms and the collapse of the mythology of philosophical ignorance. And he says that pre-cultural periods are characterized by formlessness, post-cultural by the clashing of forms. I'm going to assume that he proposes that we are in or entering or in some way besieged by a post-cultural clashing of forms. Although he talks a lot in here more about a dissolution of forms than a clashing of forms, which almost sounds like a reversion to a pre-cultural state, or the period of the birth of a new culture that he hasn't taken into account, because he doesn't present the current present world in terms of a clashing of forms, interestingly. So let's move on to the next section that I wanted to read, where he talks more about this devaluing of forms in the modern world. He says, quote, "The man of self-control is he who can consistently perform the feat of abstraction. He is therefore trained to see things under the aspect of eternity, because form is the enduring part. Thus we invariably find in the man of true culture a deep respect for forms. He approaches even those he does not understand with awareness that a deep thought lies in an old observance. Such respect distinguishes him from the barbarian on the one hand and the degenerate on the other. The truth can be expressed in another way by saying that the man of culture has a sense of style. Style requires measure. whether in space or time, for measure imparts structure, and it is structure which is essential to intellectual apprehension. That it does not matter what a man believes is a statement heard on every side today. The statement carries a fearful implication. If a man is a philosopher in the sense with which we started, what he believes tells him what the world is for. How can men who disagree about what the world is for agree about any of the minutiae of daily conduct? The statement really means that it does not matter what a man believes, so long as he does not take his beliefs seriously. Anyone can observe that this is the status to which religious belief has been reduced for many years. But suppose he does take his beliefs seriously. Then what he believes places a stamp upon his existence, and he belongs to a culture, which is a league founded on exclusive principles. To become eligible, one must be able to say the right words about the right things, which signifies in turn that one must be a man of correct sentiments. This phrase, so dear to the 18th century, carries us back to the last age that saw sentiment and reason in a proper partnership. That culture is a sentiment refined and measured by intellect becomes clear as we turn our attention to a kind of barbarism appearing in our midst and carrying unmistakable power to disintegrate. This threat is best described as the desire of immediacy, for its aim is to dissolve the formal aspects of everything and to get at the supposititious reality behind them. It is characteristic of the barbarian, whether he appears in a pre-cultural stage or emerges from below in the waning day of a civilization, to insist upon seeing a thing as it is. The desire testifies that it has nothing in himself with which to spiritualize it. The relation is one of thing to thing, without the intercession of imagination. Impatient of the veiling with which the man of higher type gives the world imaginative meaning, the barbarian and the Philistine, who is the barbarian living amid culture, demands the access of immediacy. Where the former wishes representation, the latter insists upon starkness of materiality, suspecting rightly that forms will mean restraint. There is no need to speak of Vandals and Goths, since our concern is with the vertical invasion of the barbarians in our own time. I shall cite an instance from the modern period and from the United States, so symbolical of the world of the future. The American frontiersman was a type who emancipated himself from culture by abandoning the settled institutions of the seaboard and the European motherland. Reveling in the new absence of restraint, he associated all kinds of forms with the machinery of oppression, which he had fled, and was now preparing to oppose politically. His emancipation left him impatient of symbolism, of indirect methods, and even of those enclosures of privacy which all civilized communities respect. De Tocqueville made the following observation of such freedmen. As it is on their own testimony that they are accustomed to rely, they like to discern the object which engages their attention with extreme clearness. They therefore strip off much as possible all that covers it. They rid themselves of whatever separates them from it. They remove whatever conceals it from sight, in order to view it more closely in the broad light of day. This disposition of mind soon leads them to contempt forms, which they regard as useless and inconvenient veils placed between them and the truth. The frontiersman was seeking a solvent of forms, and he found his spokesman in such writers as Mark Twain, a large part of whose work is simply a satire upon the more formal European way of doing things. As the impulse moved eastward, it encouraged a belief that the formal was the outmoded, or at least the un-American, a plebeian distrust of forms, flowering in eulogies of plainness, became the characteristic American mentality. End quote. He's really talking smack about the American West in this section, interestingly. But he talks about measure. He says self-control, someone who has self-control can perform the feat of abstraction. He's trained to see things under the aspect of eternity because form is the enduring part. And so a man of self-control is a man who participates in forms, and forms demand restraint. He says the truth can be expressed in another way by saying that the man of culture has a sense of style. Man of culture sees forms. Styles depend on forms. Style requires measure, whether in space or time, for measure imparts structure, and it is structure which is essential to intellectual apprehension. So people, in order to be civilized, have to have a sense of form, and there's a modern barbarian attempt to strip things of forms to see them as they truly are, and it's a sort of destruction of civilization and of culture to try to remove the various so-called veils of form and behavior and comprehension, language. They're the sort of unique curiosities that make us all who we are and make us who we are as a people, that we have a certain way of doing things, certain ways of facial expressions, certain ways of dressing, certain ways of standing, simple things that people adhere to because they adhere to the forms that constitute the language of culture, that all presumably should point back to some common metaphysical dream. So moving on to the continuing his discussion of the attack on forms, he says, quote, "Today, over the entire world, there are dangerous signs that culture, as such, is marked for attack because its formal requirements stand in the way of expression of the natural man. Many cannot conceive why forms should be allowed to impede the expression of honest hearts. The reason lies in one of the limitations imposed upon man. Unformed expression is ever tending toward ignorance. Good intention is primary, but it is not enough. That is the lesson of the experiment of Romanticism. The member of a culture, on the other hand, purposely avoids the relationship of immediacy. He wants the object somehow depicted and fictionalized, or, as Schopenhauer expressed it, he wants not the thing, but the idea of the thing. He is embarrassed when this is taken out of its context of proper sentiment and presented bare, for he feels that this is a reintrusion of that world which his whole conscious effort has sought to banish. Forms and conventions are the ladder of ascent, and hence the speechlessness of the man of culture when he beholds the barbarian tearing aside some veil which is half adornment, half concealment. He understands what is being done, but he cannot convey the understanding because he cannot convey the idea of sacrilege. His cries of abeste profani are not heard by those who, in the exhilaration of breaking some restraint, feel that they are extending the boundaries of power or of knowledge. Every group regarding itself as emancipated is convinced that its predecessors were fearful of reality. It looks upon euphemisms and all the veils of decency with which things were previously draped as obstructions, which it, with superior wisdom and praiseworthy courage, will now strip away. Imagination and indirection it identifies with obscurantism. The mediate is an enemy to freedom. One can see this, even in a brief lapse of time, how the man of today looks with derision upon the prohibitions of the 1890s and supposes that the violation of them has been without penalty. He would suffer such poignant disillusion had he a clear enough pattern in his soul to be able to measure differences. But one consequence of this debauchery, as we shall see, is that man loses discrimination. For, when these veils are stripped aside, we find no reality behind them, or at best, we find a reality of such commonplaceness that we would willingly undo our little act of brashness. Those will realize, who are capable of reflection, that the reality which excites us is an idea, of which the indirection, the veiling, the withholding, is part. It is our various supposals about a matter which give it meaning, not some intrinsic property which can be seized in the bare-handed fashion of the barbarian. In a wonderfully prescient passage, Burke foretold the results of such positivism when it was first unleashed by the French Revolution. All the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which, by a bland assimilation, incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. All the superadded ideas, furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies as necessary to cover the defects of our naked shivering nature and to raise it to the dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded as a ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. Barbarism and Philistinism cannot see that knowledge of material reality is a knowledge of death. The desire to get ever closer to the source of physical sensation, this is the downward pull which puts an end to ideational life. No education is worthy of the name which fails to make the point that the world is best understood from a certain distance, or that the most elementary understanding requires a degree of abstraction. To insist on less is to merge ourselves with the exterior reality, or to capitulate to the endless induction of empiricism." End quote. So he kind of attacks empiricism at the end there, a little dig, but he's really saying, again, that the various veils or ways of concealing the bare facts of nature are to be, by the modern barbarians, are to be torn away. I like this last section where he's he's actually quoting Burke here, who says, "All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off." He talks about like people of culture don't even know what to say or how to respond, because it's totally inconceivable that someone would just not want to have culture at all and just want to completely. But it's not just a matter of an ignorant tendency to want to get to the bottom of things. There's a maliciousness baked into the attacks on Western culture. It's not just the idea that this culture is impeding our clear vision of reality. I think that there's more malice than that involved. At any rate, let me jump to the next section where he talks about obscenity. And he says, quote, "Our age provides many examples of the ravages of immediacy, the clearest of which is the failure of the modern mind to recognize obscenity. This failure is not connected with the decay of Puritanism. The word is employed here in its original sense to describe that which should be enacted off stage because it is unfit for public exhibition. Such actions, it must be emphasized, may have no relation to gross animal functions. They include intense suffering and humiliation, from which the Greeks, with their habitual perspicacity and humanity, banned from their theater. The Elizabethans, on the other hand, with their robust allusions to the animal conditions of man's existence, were nonetheless not obscene. It is all in the way one touches this subject. This failure of the concept of obscenity has been concurrent with the rise of the institution of publicity, which, ever seeking to widen its field in accordance with the canon of progress, makes a virtue of desecration. In the 19th century, this change came visibly over the world, bringing expressions of concern from people who had been brought up in the tradition of proper sentiment. Propriety, like other old-fashioned anchorages, was abandoned because it inhibited something. Proud of its shamelessness, the new journalism served up in swaggering style matter which heretofore had been veiled in decent taciturnity. It was natural that so true an apostle of culture as Matthew Arnold should have sensed the mortal enemy in this. After a tour of the United States in 1888, he recorded his conviction that if one were searching for the best means to efface and kill in a nation the whole discipline of self-respect, the feeling for what is elevated, he could do no better than take the American newspapers. Is this why, 200 years before, a governor of Virginia had thanked God to the scandal of succeeding generations that there was not a newspaper in the colony? Have we here another example of the evil discerned most clearly on its first appearance? What he beheld in germ has grown so immeasurably that today we have media of publicity which actually specialize in the kind of obscenity which the cultivated, not the prurient, find repugnant, and which the wisest of the ancients forbade." End quote. So yeah, that's interesting because he really says everything really that should not be done in public or that should have a modicum of privacy surrounding it really should fall under the classing of obscenity. He says the ancient Greeks did not allow intense suffering or humiliation to appear on the scene in their theater. All such things were basically off stage and described in the scene of action. And so really everything that doesn't belong in the public sphere, everything that should be, again, hidden behind a veil, behind closed doors, is all brought right out into the public square, and there's no concept of decency or indecency. It's all just the destruction of form, the destruction of culture and the forms that are associated with modesty, that are associated with culture, the things that separate us from a pure interaction with reason. I think it's interesting that he does talk about, jumping back actually to the end of the section just before that, how knowledge of material reality is a knowledge of death. There's a sort of sense that our absolute bare, most brutal, primal, elemental nature is something that has to be held at bay. There's a sort of death that is involved with knowing too closely our own nature. He says knowledge of material reality is a knowledge of death. Our life is sort of bound up in the same types of veils that constitute culture, the symbols of things, rather than things themselves, but language of symbols representing other things is a sort of step away from the raw nature of reality, but it's also, a good portion of what our lives consist of. Like the vast majority of our lives, really. Language is, every aspect of what we do is run through with cultural components, right down to the use of language. And the dismantling of that is really like the elimination of a large part of ourselves. What could we be? How much can we be when we strip all that away? Going on about this sort of cultural deterioration, he says, quote, "It is inevitable that the decay of sentiment should be accompanied by a deterioration of human relationships, both those of the family and those of friendly association, because the passion for immediacy concentrates upon the presently advantageous. After all, there is nothing but sentiment to bind us to the very old or to the very young." Burke saw this point when he said that those who have no concern for their ancestors will, by simple application of the same rule, have none for their descendants. The decision of modern man to live in the here and now is reflecting in the neglect of aging parents, whom proper sentiment once kept in positions of honor and authority. There was a time when the elder generation was cherished, because it represented the past. Now it is avoided and thrust out of sight for the same reason. Children are liabilities. As man becomes more immersed in time and material gratification, belief in the continuum of race fades, and not all the tinkering of sociologists can put homes together again. It is sometimes said, when this point is brought up, that urban living renders relationships of the older kind impossible. There can be little doubt of the truth of the proposition, but the very fact that it is put forward as apologia is an evidence of perversity. For motive is the decisive thing, and had our view of the world remained just, congested urban living, harmful in many other ways too, would not have become the pattern. The objectification in sticks and stones of our conception of living can hardly be pleaded as cause of that conception. When people set the highest value on relationships to one another, it does not take them long to find material accommodations for these. One is dealing here, as at every other point, with our estimate of the good life. In Megalopolis, the sentiment of friendship wastes away. Friends become, in the vulgarism of modern speech, pals, who may be defined as persons whom your work compels you to associate with, or on a still more debased level, persons who will allow you to use them to your advantage. The meeting of minds, the sympathy between personalities when all cultural communities have regarded as part of the good life, demand too much sentiment for a world of machines and a false egalitarianism. One detects even a faint suspicion that friendship, because it rests upon selection, is undemocratic. It is this type of mentality which will study with perfect naivety a work on how to win friends and influence people. To one brought up in a society spiritually fused, what I shall call the metaphysical community, the idea of a campaign to win friends must be incomprehensible. Friends are attracted by one's personality, if it is of the right sort, and any conscious attempt is inseparable from guile. And the art of manipulating personalities obviously presumes disrespect for personality. Only in a splintered community, where the spirit is starved to the point of atrophy, could such an imposture flourish. End quote. So he's talking there about relationships and how people who don't have any respect for the past won't have any respect for the future. They don't respect their ancestors. And he really brings this to a sense of immediacy. And he ties a lot of things together here that I wouldn't necessarily tie together quite so strongly, that I think can't be untied in a way, which is that this sense of immediacy and a deterioration of human relationships because people are out for whatever is a sort of immediate benefit to them, and they don't want to think long term about anything. And that's sort of bound up in a sense with the trend toward materialism and the trend away from forms. I guess forms having a more of a long durability, and guiding our relationships with one another and providing them with a sense of duty and obligation, because we have sort of obligation to the forms of the culture. But a lot gets mixed up here where, children are considered liabilities. If you take a bit of an evolutionary perspective on this, if you go at the question of culture from an evolutionary perspective, the procreation and the production of children is a key component of evolutionarily successful strategies of human beings, right? We have to procreate. Evolution says we have to procreate. We have to procreate, and we have to. Our job really is to procreate. The job of every living being is to procreate and survive long enough to do that, and in some cases, provide some sort of upbringing to the offspring, right? Whatever's going to maximize the success of the genetic code. And that's not necessarily a sense of immediacy and disregard for the long term. It's perhaps an animalistic way of approaching life, but human beings have a genetic predisposition to culture. So we build cultures that include children in them and include procreation as part of the forms, because those are the sort of cultures that will be successful. And so there doesn't have to be this opposition between a focus on the material and a successful culture. Although certainly, undermining the metaphysical dream and shifting and changing the metaphysical dream into something like atheistic and pantheistic and materialistic and not built on the metaphysical dream that our culture has kind of grown up with in many ways. Obviously, that's a potentially damaging or in fact damaging phenomena that has to be really managed in a way that's going to be as least disruptful as possible. That's the tricky part about metaphysical dreams, is that they are statements about reality in such a way that if they become questioned, if they find themselves in a questionable position, they really have to adapt or die, and that's a slow, difficult adaptation to build a new metaphysical dream that's not dependent on things that are consistently proven to be untrue. So, that's like the great challenge of our age, to survive the loss of mythology. So moving on to chapter 2, he begins to talk more about distinction and hierarchy. And this section opens up with the following quote. He says, quote, "The most portentous general event of our time is the steady obliteration of those distinctions which create society. Rational society is a mirror of the logos, and this means that it has a formal structure which enables apprehension. The preservation of society is therefore directly linked with the recovery of true knowledge. For the success of our restoration, it cannot be too often said that society and mass are contradictory terms, and that those who seek to do things in the name of mass are the destroyers in our midst. If society is something which can be understood, it must have structure. If it has structure, it must have hierarchy. Against this metaphysical truth, the declamations of the Jacobins break in vain. Perhaps the most painful experience of modern consciousness is the felt loss of center. Yet, this is the inevitable result of centuries of insistence that society yield its form. Anyone can observe that people today are eager to know who is really entitled to authority, that they are looking wistfully for the sources of genuine value. In sum, they wish to know the truth, but they have been taught a perversion, which makes their chance of obtaining it less every day. The perversion is that in a just society there are no distinctions. Our course has reached a point at which the question of whether man wishes to live in society at all, or whether he wishes to live in a kind of animal relationship, must be raised in all seriousness. For if the prescription against every kind of distinction continues, there is no hope of integration except on the level of instinct. After man evolves his metaphysical dream and becomes capable of rational sentiment, he recognizes two grounds of elevation, knowledge and virtue. If these are not one, which problems need not be decided here. The good man, the man with proved allegiance to correct sentiment, has been the natural trustee of authority. The man of knowledge has been necessary for such duties as require system and foresight. With these criteria, it has been possible to erect a structure which mirrors our respect for value. In proportion to their contributions to the spiritual ideal which the creation expresses, men have found lodgment on the various levels, with the essential feeling that, since this structure is the Logos, their stations were not arbitrary but natural and right. This is society, in which the human being has a sense of direction. Literally, it might be said he knows up from down, because he knows where the higher goods are to be looked for. It is possible for him to live on the plane of spirit and intelligence because some points of reference are fixed. End quote. So here you have the concept that society demands structure. There's the mass, which is just the mob, all the people as a giant undifferentiated mass, and then there's society, which is has a structure to it and has people in different positions and with different levels and domains of authority, so that everybody sort of knows where they're supposed to go, and the whole thing makes sense. And this is a sort of social form imposed upon reality. It's not just a brute. It's not just a brute dominance hierarchy. It has a purpose. It has demands that are placed upon its members, and it has enforcement. It has all sorts of hierarchy, distinction, structure to it that allows it to function. And he says, after man evolves his metaphysical dream and becomes capable of rational sentiment, he recognizes two grounds of elevation, knowledge, and virtue. And so the good people, virtuous people, are the natural trustees of authority. Knowledgeable people are also natural trustees of authority. People who are good and people who are knowledgeable and or both should be put into positions of leadership. This is the sense of society. Now, how to go about doing that and whether, one system is better than the other, surely those conversations happen and, modifications of the structure of society in order to help it run best in order to, it's really like to me, it's a pragmatic question. Do the structures of society perform their function? Do they have something that they're intended to do? Do they exist for a reason? And do they effectively do what they're supposed to do? And if so, then they are good. And to some extent, they need to just be accepted as good, like I've spoken of. They don't need to be analyzed constantly, but they are subject to analysis in general. Although we don't want to question everything all the time, we don't want to undermine every aspect of our society at every moment. We do want to keep the position open that society is able to be adjusted and modified over time. As we looked at in the Darwinism book, people are always sort of trying to utilize society, create society, shift society to benefit them. It falls into patterns of what ways benefit certain groups of people, family lines, and things of that nature, and it solidifies into a position that's beneficial to the people who control it. But it still shifts over time. We all see societies and cultures shift over time. So that's a healthy thing. But to utterly dismantle society by trying to tear away everything that separates, your mind from the bare basic facts of reality, I guess it's like that's mythologizing. I mean, a world that sees all mythology as an impediment to the truth is sort of a world without culture. Culture stands between the observing mind and the pure unadulterated truth. I mean, we don't ever have access to the pure truth, and so we sort of fill in some of the gaps with mythology. In a world with a singular truth, it seems kind of disappointing to think that all various cultures would eventually arrive at the same place and all their distinction would melt away as they all embrace the singular truth. That seems a little disappointing. But I think that there's always going to have to be some balance here, because culture has its own value and it has its own functions that aren't always completely understood or able to be easily replicated. So I don't know. Let's move on to the next question. He's talking about equalitarianism. He says, quote, "The most insidious idea employed to break down society is an undefined equalitarianism. That this concept does not make sense even in the most elementary applications has proved no deterrent to its spread, and we shall have something to say later on about modern man's growing incapacity for logic." An American political writer of the last century, confronted with the statement that all men are created free and equal, asked whether it would not be more accurate to say that no man was ever created free, and no two men ever created equal. Such hard-headedness would today be mistaken for frivolity. Thomas Jefferson, after his long apostleship to radicalism, made it the labor of his old age to create an educational system which would be a means of sorting out according to gifts and attainments. Such equalitarianism is harmful because it always presents itself as a redress of injustice, whereas in truth it is the very opposite. I would mention here the fact, obvious to any candid observer, that equality is found most often in the mouths of those engaged in artful self-promotion. These secretly cherish the latter to high designs, but find that they can mount the lower rungs more easily by making use of the catchword. We do not necessarily grudge them their rise, but the concept they foster is fatal to the harmony of the world. The comity of peoples, in groups large or small, rests not upon this chimerical notion of equality, but upon fraternity, a concept which long antedates it in history because it goes immeasurably deeper in human sentiment. The ancient feeling of brotherhood carries obligations of which equality knows nothing. It calls for respect and protection, for brotherhood is status in family, and family is, by nature, hierarchical. It demands patience with little brother, and it may sternly exact duty of big brother. It places people in a network of sentiment, not of rights, that hortus siccus of modern vainglory. It is eloquent of that loss of respect for logic, to which we owe so many disasters, that the French Revolution made equality and fraternity coordinates. In so doing, it offered a foretaste of the contemporary political campaign, which shamelessly promises everything. Equality is a disorganizing concept, insofar as human relationships mean order. It is order without a design. It attempts a meaningless and profitless regimentation of what has been ordered from time immemorial by the scheme of things. No society can rightly offer less than equality before the law. but there can be no equality of condition between youth and age or between the sexes. There can be no equality even between friends. The rule is that each shall act where he is strong. The assignment of identical roles produces first confusion and then alienation, as we have increasing opportunity to observe. Not only is this disorganizing heresy busily confounding the most natural social groupings, it is also creating a reservoir of poisonous envy. How much of the frustration of the modern world proceeds from starting with the assumption that all are equal, finding that this cannot be so, and then having to realize that one can no longer fall back on the bond of fraternity. However paradoxical it may seem, fraternity has existed in the most hierarchical organizations. It exists, as we have just noted, in that archetype of hierarchy, the family. The essence of cooperation is congeniality, the feeling of having been born together. Fraternity directs attention to others, equality to self. And the passion for equality is simultaneous with the growth of egotism. The frame of duty which fraternity erects is itself the source of ideal conduct. Where men feel that society means station, the highest and the lowest see their endeavors contributing to a common end, and they are in harmony rather than in competition. It will be found as a general rule that those parts of the world which have talked least of equality have, in the solid fact of their social life, exhibited the greatest fraternity. Such was true of feudal Europe before people succumbed to various forms of the proposal that every man should be king. Nothing is more manifest than that as this social distance has diminished and all groups have moved nearer equality, suspicion and hostility have increased. In the present world, there is little of trust and less of loyalty. People do not know what to expect of one another. Leaders will not lead, and servants will not serve. End quote. So, yeah, he's talking about the dissolution of hierarchy in society and the advance of equalitarianism. And he talks about fraternity and comparing equality and fraternity and how the French Revolution tried to pin the two together, that equality and fraternity were somehow related. But he says fraternity is really what holds groups together, and fraternal organizations, such as the family, are hierarchical. Fraternity goes with hierarchy. It's societies where people have a position, but they all know that they're part of one family, they're all part of one group, they're all moving toward one common end. There's a sense of loyalty that comes in to that versus constantly living in a world of rights rather than duties, and constantly bickering between one another for their own, just share of the pie. There is no fraternity there. There's just people constrained within some framework, each trying to get the best of the getting. And so fraternity really does seem like the vastly superior bonding agent. And equality, equality is not something that it should, I think, be totally, utterly ignored, right? I mean, like I talked about in, I want to say it was the Hobbes episode, people will ultimately revolt if they feel, and that there's nothing new about that. There's nothing modern necessarily about revolution, but people will revolt if their leader is too brutal or too harsh with them. So in some sense, like, as long as everyone feels like they're part of the team, in such a way that they're not going to want to revolt, then that's not necessarily equality, but it's everyone at least getting enough to consider themselves like in the team and not an exploited outsider. That's not necessarily equality, but I guess what it is a sort of check on pure hierarchy, right? Hierarchy can only go so far before it's breaking the will of people and making people like want to revolt. The last section I'm going to read here is just to dip a little bit into chapter 3, where he talks about fragmentation and obsession. I'm only going to read this one section from chapter 3. There's a lot of good stuff in this book, definitely beyond the parts that I'm covering here in the beginning. But here, talking about fragmentation and obsession, he says, quote, "It is an ancient belief, going back to classical antiquity, that specialization of any kind is illiberal in a free man. A man willing to bury himself in the details of some small endeavor has been considered lost to these larger considerations which must occupy the mind of the ruler. The attitude is well expressed in King Philip's famous taunt to his son Alexander, who had learned to perform skillfully upon the flute. 'Are you not ashamed, son, to play so well?' It is contained in the hierarchy of knowledge in Aristotle's Metaphysics. It is explained by Plutarch with the observation that he who busies himself with mean occupations produces in the very pains he takes about things of little use evidence against himself of his neglect and indisposition to what is really good. The attitude is encouraged in men of letters of the 17th and 18th centuries. They wished to be known as gentlemen first, and as writers only incidentally. Finally, there is the story of the barber who congratulated Napoleon for not having a scholar's knowledge of the proper pronunciation of Alexandria. To regard these as exhibitions of priggishness is to miss the point entirely. They are expressions of contempt for the degradation of specialization and pedantry. Specialization develops only part of a man. A man partially developed is deformed, and one deformed is the last person to be thought of as a ruler. So runs the irresistible logic of the position. Science is therefore not a pursuit for such a one, because it demands an ever more minute inspection of the physical world. It makes an ideal of specialism, and one may recall Nietzsche's figure of the scientist who spends his life studying the brain structure of the leech. Is it necessary to press further the point that, when such matters come to be pursued as knowledge, the task of synthesis approaches impossibility? The position of the philosophic doctor, and of his secular heir the gentleman, was thus correct. For them, the highest knowledge concerned, respectively, the relation of men to God and the relation of men to men. They did not expect to learn what they most needed to know by fleeing center, that is, by diving ever deeper into the mysteries of the physical world. Such is escape and moral defeatism. When Socrates declared in the Phaedrus that he learned not from the trees of the country but from men of the city, he was exposing the fallacy of scientism. At this point, the student ceases to be doctor of philosophy, since he is no longer capable of philosophy. He has made himself an essentially ridiculous figure, and this would have been perceived had not the public, undergoing the same process of debasement, found a different ground on which to venerate him. Knowledge was power. The very character of the new researches lent them to ad hoc purposes. It was soon a banality that the scholar contributes to civilization by adding to its dominion over nature. It is just as if Plato's philosopher had left the city to look at the trees and then had abandoned speculative wisdom for dendrology. The people who would urge just this course are legion among us today. The facts on the periphery, they feel, are somehow more certain." End quote. So he's just talking about specialization here, and I think that, if we're going to have the level of technological prowess that we have, that demands specialization in a lot of areas. No single person is going to understand the depths of the various specializations that are necessary and still understand all the other things there are to know. So specialization has its part, but I think maybe when it comes to rulers, rulers need to be a little more broad. Like the fact that so many lawyers are in Congress seems like a sort of strange specialization, and maybe it's specialization in the law, and that's kind of what they do. So I guess I get it. But there's something that's missing, and that's, my podcast has all kinds of different books. I don't really specialize. I'm 123 episodes in. Had I done all of those episodes about protectionist economics, for example, I was 123 books deep into protectionist economics, or 123 books deep into William James, or what have you. I would definitely be an expert in that particular field, but I've been bouncing all over the place, and I think there's something valuable in being sort of a generalist. There's an ability to see patterns and be able to get a view of the big picture as opposed to the minute details. Maybe that's just me. I find that sort of big picture pattern recognition a really useful thing to have, and particularly probably useful for people involved in politics to be able to see those sorts of big pictures and not get bogged down in legal terminology or the legal frame of mind. But anyhow, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening. Talk to you again next time.